She was just another old waitress bringing coffee refills, until the young soldier at table 12 noticed the faded scar on her wrist and realized he was being served by a legend he'd only heard about in classified briefings. Welcome to Stories of Secret Heroes. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden service and silent recognition, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who never asked to be remembered. The Sunrise Diner sat on the edge of Highway 67, wedged between a Texaco station and a truck stop that had seen better decades. Its neon sign flickered the word "Eat" in faded red letters, and the parking lot was cracked asphalt held together by weeds and good intentions. Inside, vinyl booths were patched with duct tape, the linoleum floor bore the scuff marks of 1,000 work boots, and the coffee machine wheezed like an old man climbing stairs. It wasn't much to look at, but it was honest, real, the kind of place where conversations were quiet and nobody asked too many questions. Margaret Rose had worked there for 18 years, 4 months and 12 days, not that anyone was counting. She arrived every morning at 4:30 sharp, 30 minutes before the official opening time, because that's what real preparation looked like. She unlocked the front door with keys that had worn smooth in her palm, flipped the hand-painted sign from closed to open, and began the same ritual she'd perfected through muscle memory and discipline. First, the coffee. 2 pots of regular, 1 decaf, all brewed strong enough to wake the dead. Then the grill, heated to exactly 375 degrees because anything less was disrespectful to the food and anything more would burn the edges of the eggs. She filled the napkin dispensers, checked the salt and pepper shakers, and arranged the condiment bottles with the precision of someone who understood that details mattered, even when nobody was watching. Her uniform never varied: black polyester pants that had faded to charcoal, a white cotton blouse that she ironed every night before bed, and a blue apron that had once been navy but had softened to the color of old denim. Her grey hair was always pulled back in a simple bun, secured with a black elastic band that she replaced every 2 weeks whether it needed it or not. She wore sensible white sneakers with arch supports and carried a small order pad in her left apron pocket, a black pen in her right. Margaret moved through the narrow aisles between tables like water finding its path downhill, efficient, quiet, never wasting a step. She knew which booth creaked when you slid in, which coffee cup had a chip on the handle, which regular liked his eggs over easy with the yolk broken and mixed with the hash browns. The knowledge came from 18 years of paying attention, of treating every customer like they mattered, even when they barely noticed she existed. Most people looked through her rather than at her. She was part of the infrastructure, like the humming refrigerator or the ceiling fan that wobbled slightly in the corner. They called her sweetheart, and hon, and miss, with the casual familiarity reserved for people whose names they'd never bothered to learn. She didn't mind. In fact, she preferred it that way. Invisibility had always been her greatest strength. The morning regulars knew her routine by heart. Frank, the retired postal worker, got his coffee black and his newspaper read aloud when the print was too small. Sarah, the night shift nurse heading home after 12 hours at the county hospital, wanted her scrambled eggs with cheese and her orange juice in a clean glass, not the plastic cups. Bill, the trucker who stopped by twice a week, ordered the same thing every time: stack of pancakes, side of bacon crispy enough to snap, and coffee refills until his rig was loaded and ready for the next stretch of highway. They tipped small but consistently, left their tables reasonably clean, and treated Margaret with the kind of polite indifference that suggested they saw her as competent but forgettable, which was exactly how she'd trained them to see her. In her previous life, being unremarkable had been a survival skill. Now it was simply habit. That Tuesday morning in late September started like any other. The breakfast rush brought its usual parade of familiar faces and strangers passing through. Construction workers grabbing coffee to go before heading to the new shopping center being built on the north side of town. Retirees stretching their morning coffee into a social hour, sharing gossip and weather complaints with the patience of people who had nowhere urgent to be. A few travelers from the highway motel next door, consulting maps and GPS devices while consuming eggs and toast with the mechanical efficiency of people trying to get back on the road. Margaret worked the morning shift alone, as she had every Tuesday for the past 3 years. She took orders without writing them down unless they were complicated, poured coffee refills before cups went empty, and cleared tables with the smooth rhythm of someone who had learned to work in a flow state. Her feet barely hurt anymore, even after 6-hour shifts. Her hands stayed steady even when the coffee pot was full and heavy. Her smile remained genuine even when customers were rude or demanding. At exactly 7:20 a.m. the front door chimed and a young man walked in alone. Early 20s, Margaret estimated, with the kind of posture that announced military training even when he was trying to blend in. His hair was regulation short but not fresh cut. His jeans were dark and unwrinkled, and his grey t-shirt fit the way clothes fit when someone understands the difference between looking casual and looking sloppy. He chose the corner booth in section 3, positioned himself facing the door, and spent 30 seconds scanning the restaurant before picking up the laminated menu. Margaret gave him 2 minutes to settle in before approaching with the coffee pot and a clean cup. Standard procedure: let the customer get comfortable, assess their mood, then engage with the appropriate level of friendliness. This one looked tired but alert, the kind of tired that comes from travel rather than sleeplessness. "Coffee to start?" she asked, her voice carrying the professional warmth she'd perfected over decades of customer service. "Please," he said, turning the cup right side up with practiced efficiency. "Black." His accent carried hints of the Southwest, maybe Texas or New Mexico. His hands were clean but calloused, and when he thanked her for the coffee, he made brief eye contact before looking away. Polite but guarded. Margaret had served enough soldiers over the years to recognize the type: young, well-trained, carrying the invisible weight that came from seeing things most people never would. She left him alone to study the menu while she handled the other tables. Frank needed his eggs over medium instead of over easy this morning because his stomach had been acting up. Sarah wanted extra butter for her toast and asked if Margaret had seen the news about the factory closure on the other side of the county. Bill was running late for a delivery and needed his breakfast box to go, with extra napkins because he'd be eating while driving. 20 minutes later she returned to the corner booth. The young man had made his decision. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, hash browns and a side of bacon. Simple order, nothing complicated. He handed her the menu with another brief nod of thanks. "Coming right up," Margaret said, writing the order on her pad more from habit than necessity. As she turned to walk away, she noticed him pull out his phone and begin typing a text message. His thumbs moved with the rapid precision of someone who had grown up with technology, but his eyes kept flicking up to monitor the restaurant around him. Old habits from recent training, Margaret thought, or recent experience. She delivered his breakfast 18 minutes later, arranged on the plate with the same care she gave every order. Eggs centered, hash browns on the left, bacon crisp and properly drained, toast cut diagonally with butter already melting into the golden surface. She set the plate down gently, refilled his coffee cup without being asked, and was reaching across the table to straighten his silverware when it happened. The sleeve of her blouse rode up slightly as she leaned forward, exposing the inside of her left wrist for just a moment. Most people wouldn't have noticed. Most people weren't looking. But this young man was trained to notice details, trained to recognize things that didn't quite fit, and what he saw made him freeze with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. A scar. Not the kind from an accident or surgery, but something deliberate and precise. It started at her wrist bone and disappeared under the fabric of her sleeve, a thin white line that had faded with time but never quite vanished. Next to it, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, was a small tattoo. 2 numbers in black ink, so old and faded they looked like shadows, and below them a symbol that most people would mistake for decorative artwork. But Private Danny Rodriguez knew better. 3 weeks ago he'd been sitting in a briefing room at Bagram Air Base, listening to an intelligence officer explain the history of covert operations in Central America. The officer had shown them slides of classified documents, most of them heavily redacted, describing missions that officially never happened, extraction teams that didn't exist on paper, operatives whose names were never recorded in official files. And in one of those slides there had been a symbol, a mark that identified operatives who had completed the most dangerous missions, who had proven themselves in situations where failure meant death or worse. The kind of mark that was tattooed using ink mixed with ash from the gear of fallen comrades, applied in ceremony that bound the wearer to a brotherhood of silence that lasted until death. Danny set his coffee cup down with exaggerated care, his mind racing through possibilities and implications. The numbers weren't random, they were coordinates, or dates, or operational codes. The symbol wasn't decorative, it was a marker, a sign of belonging to a unit that existed in the shadows between official military branches and civilian contractor work. He watched Margaret walk away, refilling coffee for other customers, taking orders, moving through her routine with the smooth efficiency of someone who had learned to work while maintaining complete situational awareness. Now that he was looking for it, he could see other things. The way she positioned herself to watch all the exits, the way her left hand remained slightly tensed, as if ready to reach for something that wasn't there. The way she moved through the narrow aisles without ever turning her back to the room for more than a few seconds. Danny pulled out his phone and did something he'd never done in a civilian setting. He accessed the military database using his clearance codes. It took several minutes of careful searching, navigating through layers of classification and redaction, but eventually he found what he was looking for. Buried in a partially declassified document about covert operations in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Honduras, there was a single reference that made his blood run cold. Female asset MR. Extraction specialist, status classified, successful completion of 17 high-risk personnel recovery missions in hostile territory, 0 operational failures, 0 friendly casualties. Recommended for highest commendation, recommendation classified pending operational security review, asset terminated employment voluntarily upon completion of tour, current status unknown. Danny looked up from his phone and studied Margaret with new eyes. She was taking an order from a family of 4 who had just walked in, smiling at their young daughter and asking if she wanted her eggs shaped like a smiley face. Her movements were precise, controlled, but there was warmth in her interaction with the child. She was someone who had learned to compartmentalize, to separate the person she had been from the person she chose to be now. When she came back to refill his coffee cup, Danny made a decision that would change both of their lives. He waited until she was close enough that only she could hear him, then spoke in the quiet tone he'd learned to use when sharing classified information. "Ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that mark on your wrist, was that from the Honduras operation in '87? Margaret's hand stopped moving. The coffee pot hung suspended in mid-air, steam rising from the spout like incense. For just a second, her entire body went perfectly still, and Danny saw something flicker across her face that hadn't been there before. Not fear, not surprise, but something deeper, recognition. The look of someone who had just been seen after years of being invisible. She set the coffee pot down with deliberate care and looked directly at him for the first time. Her eyes, which had seemed gentle and unremarkable moments before, now held a depth that spoke of things witnessed and burdens carried. They were the eyes of someone who had learned to look at the world differently, to see threats and opportunities and escape routes in every room she entered. "You shouldn't know about that," she said quietly, her voice carrying an authority that hadn't been there when she was taking his breakfast order. "I know enough," Danny replied, matching her tone. "Enough to know that you saved a lot of people who never came home to thank you." Margaret studied him for a long moment, her gaze moving from his face to his hands to his posture, reading him the way she had once read hostile environments for signs of danger. She saw the intelligence in his eyes, the discipline in his bearing, the weight of recent experience in the way he held his shoulders. This wasn't a curious civilian or a military enthusiast. This was someone who had earned the right to ask the question. Without saying another word, she slid into the booth across from him. The move was so smooth and natural that none of the other customers noticed, but Danny recognized it as a tactical decision. She was positioning herself for a conversation that required privacy, control, and the ability to disengage quickly if necessary. "What unit?" she asked, her voice still quiet but now carrying the tone of someone conducting a debriefing. 25th Infantry Division, 2nd Brigade Combat Team, Danny answered. "Just back from Kandahar Province, 3 weeks home, heading to Fort Hood for reassignment." Margaret nodded slowly. She understood the geography of modern warfare, the way deployments worked, the rhythm of military life that most civilians never grasped. "Afghanistan is different from Central America," she said. "Different terrain, different enemy, different rules of engagement. But some things never change. They told us about the 1980s operations in our intelligence briefing," Danny continued, "about the extraction teams that went in when conventional forces couldn't. They said there was one operative who could get anyone out of anywhere. They called her the Ghost." For the first time that morning, Margaret smiled. It wasn't the professional smile she used with customers, but something genuine and slightly sad. "Margaret Rose," she said, extending her hand across the table. "Sergeant First Class, retired 28 years ago, and never looked back." Danny shook her hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of rope work and weapons handling, the strength that came from years of carrying heavy gear across difficult terrain. "Private Danny Rodriguez," he said, "and I have to ask, why here? Why this place?" Margaret withdrew her hand and looked around the diner, her gaze taking in the faded decor, the worn booths, the everyday mundanity of a place where nothing exciting ever happened. "Because," she said finally, "sometimes the best place to disappear is right in plain sight, and because someone has to make sure the coffee stays hot for soldiers passing through." She stood up then, smoothing her apron and returning to her role as if the last 10 minutes had been just another routine customer interaction. But something had changed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. Danny watched her walk away, back to her tables, back to her routine, but now he saw everything differently. He saw the way she carried herself, like someone who had learned to move silently through hostile territory. The way she positioned herself to maintain visual contact with all entrances and exits. The way her left hand remained slightly flexed, muscle memory from years of being ready to draw a weapon at a moment's notice. The way she scanned faces with the systematic attention of someone who had been trained to identify threats in civilian populations. When Margaret returned to clear his empty plate, Danny was ready. He had folded 2 $50 bills inside his napkin, far more than necessary for a $12 breakfast, but nowhere near enough for what she had given him. Under the money, he placed his unit challenge coin, a circular piece of bronze bearing the emblem of his brigade, and a handwritten note on a napkin that said simply, "Thank you for your service," both of them. Margaret discovered the gift after Danny had left, driving away in a pickup truck with Texas plates that disappeared into the morning traffic. She held the challenge coin for a long moment, feeling its weight in her palm, remembering similar ceremonies from her own service when such tokens carried the weight of brotherhood and shared sacrifice. She slipped the coin into her apron pocket next to her order pad, where it would remain for the rest of her shift and every shift after. Some things were worth keeping. Some recognition was worth accepting. And sometimes, after years of invisibility, it was enough to know that one person had looked close enough to see the truth. That evening, sitting in her small apartment above the hardware store, Margaret opened a box she hadn't touched in 5 years. Inside were photographs, commendations and letters from families of soldiers she had brought home from places they were never supposed to have been. She found the one she was looking for, a letter from the sister of a pilot she had extracted from the jungle in Nicaragua, written 10 years after the fact when classification levels had been lowered enough for family members to learn what had really happened to their loved ones. Meanwhile, Danny Rodriguez was 300 miles down Highway 67, but he couldn't stop thinking about the woman who had served him breakfast. When he stopped for gas near the Oklahoma border, he made a phone call to his former squad leader, now stationed at the Pentagon. "Sir," he said, "I need to report something. I think I met someone today who deserves to be remembered." The conversation that followed was brief but significant. Within 48 hours, Margaret's name was quietly added to a classified list of veterans whose service would be acknowledged in briefings for young soldiers who needed to understand what real heroism looked like. Her story would be shared in training sessions, though her current location would remain protected. Margaret never knew about that phone call. She never knew that her decades of silence had been quietly honored by a new generation of warriors who understood the weight of classified service. She just kept pouring coffee, taking orders, and moving through her quiet life with the knowledge that some secrets are worth keeping, and some recognition is worth waiting for. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning during the slow period between breakfast and lunch, 2 men in civilian clothes walked into the Sunrise Diner. They were obviously military despite their attempts to blend in, carrying themselves with the alertness of special operations personnel. They ordered coffee and sat in the corner booth, the same one where Danny Rodriguez had sat, and watched Margaret work. When she approached their table, the older of the 2 men spoke quietly. "Ma'am, we understand you knew Sergeant Rodriguez from the 25th Infantry. We're from his new unit, and we wanted to thank you for the kindness you showed him." Margaret poured their coffee without comment, but she noticed that both men wore small pins on their civilian jackets. Special Forces. The kind of soldiers who understood the value of silence and the weight of unspoken service. "He's a good soldier," she said simply. "Yes, ma'am," the younger man agreed. "And he wanted us to give you this." He placed a small package on the table, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Inside was a photograph of Danny in full combat gear, standing with his new team somewhere in a desert that could have been any of several countries where such photographs weren't supposed to exist. On the back in his careful handwriting were the words, "Still serving, still learning from the best." Margaret kept that photograph in her apron pocket, next to the challenge coin and her order pad. Some connections transcended time and distance. Some lessons were passed from one generation of warriors to the next through moments of recognition that happened in the most unlikely places. And every morning at 4:30 she continued to unlock the front door of the Sunrise Diner, flip the sign to open, and begin the routine that had become her second career. Because service, real service, didn't end with retirement. It just changed uniforms. So I ask you, have you ever met someone like Margaret? Someone who served in silence, who carried their history quietly, who deserved recognition they never sought? Have you encountered hidden heroes in your own life? People whose past service or sacrifice remained invisible until some moment of recognition revealed the truth? Share their stories in the comments. Tell us about the veterans, the first responders, the quiet heroes who continue serving long after their official duties ended. Because here at Stories of Secret Heroes, we believe that the most powerful warriors aren't always the ones who get medals or parades. Sometimes they're the ones who disappear into ordinary life and continue serving in ways no one ever notices. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it. Help us make sure that people like Margaret are never truly invisible. And the next time someone serves you coffee, pours your drink, or provides any kind of service with quiet professionalism, look a little closer. You might be sitting across from a legend who chose to hide in plain sight. Remember, the most powerful stories don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they wait patiently for someone wise enough to look past the surface and recognize the warrior underneath.